Good evening. On a frigid November morning in 1889, a man named Joseph Brokenwing stood at the edge of Cumberland Gap, staring down at the sprawling coal mining camps of eastern Kentucky. The temperature hovered around 38 degrees, fog clinging to the valleys like smoke, obscuring the railroad tracks that had brought him here against his will. He was 2,000 miles from the Arizona desert where he'd been born, 34 years old, carrying skills learned from childhood in the Chiricahua Apache homeland, and refined through 8 years of imprisonment that had transformed him from peaceful farmer into something the mountain people would come to call the Shadow Walker. A man who would kill 23 people across 14 months before disappearing into legend that persists in Appalachian folklore to this day. Joseph's journey to these mountains began in the White Mountains of Arizona Territory, where he'd been born in 1855 to a Chiricahua Apache family that had lived in relative peace with Mexican and American settlers, trading game and handcrafted goods for tools and supplies they couldn't produce themselves. His father, Running Elk, had taught him tracking from age 5, showed him how to read disturbed earth and broken branches, how to move through pine forest without sound, how to survive on minimal food and water when hunting required days away from camp. His mother, Morning Star, had taught him patience and observation, the spiritual practices that connected Apache people to land they'd inhabited for centuries, before European arrival changed everything. The 1870s brought escalating conflict between Apache bands and American military forces, attempting to confine all Apache people to reservations where they could be controlled and where their traditional hunting grounds could be opened to white settlement and resource extraction. Joseph's family had avoided direct conflict, lived quietly in isolated canyon, where they maintained traditional ways while staying clear of both military patrols and the more militant Apache warriors who raided settlements and attacked supply trains in resistance to forced relocation. But isolation provided no protection when Army Colonel Benjamin Grierson ordered comprehensive sweep of White Mountains in spring 1881, determined to round up every Apache person regardless of whether they'd participated in hostilities or had lived peacefully. Joseph was 26 years old when cavalry troopers surrounded his family's camp at dawn on April 12, 1881. They gave no warning, simply opened fire on anyone who moved, treating peaceful Apache camp as enemy position that needed to be eliminated rather than civilian settlement that should have been approached diplomatically. Running Elk died in first volley, shot through chest while trying to protect Morning Star, who was killed moments later by trooper who claimed she'd been reaching for weapon, when actually she'd been reaching for 4-year-old grandson who'd been crying in terror. Joseph's wife, Silver Dawn, was shot while running toward their 6-year-old daughter, Redbird, who stood frozen in shock as her mother fell dead 10 feet away. Joseph himself took bullet through left shoulder, the impact spinning him to ground where he lay among bodies of his family, pretending to be dead while troopers moved through camp, shooting anyone who showed signs of life. Redbird survived only because she remained completely still, traumatized into silence that would last 3 weeks, standing motionless while troopers burned every structure in camp and loaded 14 survivors, including Joseph and Redbird, onto wagons for transport to Fort Apache, where they had be processed and sent to reservation. Joseph's shoulder wound became infected during 3-day journey, fever rising to dangerous levels while he was chained in wagon bed with no medical attention, no water beyond what guards occasionally threw in his direction. No acknowledgement that he was human being deserving of basic care rather than prisoner of war who'd forfeited rights to humane treatment. Fort Apache's military hospital treated his wound only after commanding officer decided that allowing prisoners to die from infected injuries before they could be properly processed might generate unwanted scrutiny from Eastern newspapers that had begun questioning Army's treatment of Apache prisoners. The doctor who cleaned and stitched Joseph's shoulder told him he was lucky. That bullet had missed major arteries and that infection hadn't spread to bone, that he'd recover fully if wound was kept clean, and if he avoided strenuous activity for 6 weeks. But recovery meant being healthy enough to be shipped to reservation, to be confined on land that wasn't his people's traditional territory, to watch Redbird grow up in poverty and cultural destruction that reservations represented. The San Carlos Reservation in southeastern Arizona Territory was where Army sent Joseph and Redbird in May 1881, along with 83 other Chiricahua Apache survivors of Grierson's sweep. San Carlos occupied 1,800 square miles of desert and low mountains, home to over 4 Zudozaron Apache people from various bands, all confined to a reservation that provided minimal resources, and that was administered by Bureau of Indian Affairs agents whose corruption and incompetence were legendary even by standards of agency known for both. Agent Theodore Holt ran San Carlos like personal fiefdom, skimming money allocated for food and supplies, selling government-provided cattle to white ranchers rather than distributing beef to Apache families as intended, punishing any complaints about conditions by reducing already inadequate rations, or by recommending troublemakers be transferred to military prison. Holt particularly resented Apache people who maintained traditional practices, viewed cultural persistence as threat to his authority and to civilizing mission that justified reservation system in minds of policymakers who had designed it. Joseph and Redbird arrived at San Carlos to find conditions worse than any description could have conveyed. Food rations provided enough calories to prevent starvation, but not enough to maintain health, particularly for children and elderly who needed more nutrition than minimal cornmeal and occasional beef provided. Water was scarce during summer months, when creek that ran through reservations slowed to trickle that dozens of families competed to access. Housing consisted of canvas tents that provided no insulation against winter cold or summer heat, that deteriorated rapidly and were replaced only when complete collapse made them uninhabitable even by Holt's minimal standards. Redbird's silence persisted through summer 1881, the trauma of watching her mother shot and her grandparents killed having stolen her voice completely. Joseph tried everything to help her speak again, told her stories about running elk's hunting exploits, sang songs Morningstar had taught him, held her while she cried soundlessly at night. But nothing worked, and reservation's complete lack of medical or psychological care meant Joseph had no professional help to offer child whose trauma was obvious but whose treatment was impossible given agency's indifference to Apache suffering. The injustice of confinement weighed on Joseph constantly. He'd never fought against Americans, never raided settlements or attacked travelers, had lived peacefully with his family in isolated canyon, where they'd bothered no one and threatened nothing. Yet he was imprisoned on reservation along with warriors who'd actively resisted, treated identically to those who'd killed soldiers and civilians, punished for belonging to ethnic group that Army had decided needed to be controlled, regardless of individual behavior or peaceful intentions. Joseph attempted to make best of impossible situation. He worked reservation jobs when available, earned minimal wages that supplemented inadequate rations, tried to maintain some traditional practices despite Holt's disapproval. He taught Redbird tracking and plant knowledge, shared running elk's lessons about reading land and understanding animal behavior, tried to preserve cultural knowledge that reservation system was designed to eradicate through forced assimilation and deliberate destruction of traditional ways of life. But San Carlos was destroying Apache people systematically. Disease spread through overcrowded camps, tuberculosis and typhoid killing dozens annually because sanitation was inadequate, and medical care was non-existent beyond what Army doctor provided when visiting reservation quarterly to treat most severe cases. Alcoholism increased as men who'd been hunters and warriors found themselves with no purpose beyond waiting for rations and no prospect of life beyond confinement. Suicide rates among young Apache men reached levels that would have triggered intervention if victims had been white Americans rather than conquered indigenous people whose suffering was viewed as inevitable consequence of military defeat. Redbird began speaking again in January 1882, 9 months after her mother's death. Her first words asking Joseph whether Morningstar and Silver Dawn were in spirit world or whether they were simply gone. Joseph told her what his mother had taught him, that Apache people continued after death in form that remained connected to land and to living family members, that Morningstar and Silver Dawn watched over them, even though they couldn't be seen or touched. Redbird accepted this quietly, then asked whether Running Elk and Silver Dawn would want her to forget Apache ways and become white person, as Agent Holt insisted was necessary for civilization and progress. Joseph's answer was careful, mindful that wrong words might reach Holt and result in punishment. He told Redbird that her grandparents and mother would want her to survive, to adapt to circumstances while preserving what could be preserved, to remember who she was even if she had to pretend to be someone else to satisfy people who controlled her life. The conversation marked beginning of Redbird's dual existence, outwardly compliant with reservation rules while privately maintaining connection to traditional knowledge and practices that Joseph shared with her during early mornings before other people were awake. The summer of 1882 brought tragedy that would change Joseph's trajectory permanently. Redbird developed fever in August, temperature rising despite Joseph's attempts to cool her with wet cloths, and despite his request for medical attention from Reservation's administrative office. Agent Holt's assistant told Joseph that doctor wouldn't visit until scheduled quarterly inspection in October, that minor fevers didn't justify special trips, that Apache children got sick frequently and that most recovered without treatment because their constitutions were naturally hardy. Redbird's condition worsened over 3 days, fever spiking above 104 degrees, delirium setting in as her small body fought infection that Joseph couldn't identify and couldn't treat without medical supplies he didn't have. He carried her to administrative office on 4th day, demanded that Holt send for a doctor immediately, explained that Redbird was dying and needed help that only trained physician could provide. Holt refused, told Joseph that making special arrangements for one sick child would set precedent that would result in constant requests for medical attention, that if Redbird died it would be unfortunate but not exceptional, given high mortality rates among reservation children. Joseph's rage in that moment almost led to violence that would have resulted in his arrest and execution. Only thought of leaving Redbird completely alone prevented him from attacking Holt physically, from expressing fury at man whose indifference to child suffering represented everything wrong with reservation systems and with people who administered it. He returned to tent where Redbird lay barely conscious, held her through night while her breathing became labored and her skin burned with fever that was consuming her from within. Redbird died August 15, 1882, 7 years old, killed by infection that could have been treated if Agent had cared enough to summon doctor, if Bureau of Indian Affairs had provided adequate medical resources, if Apache children's lives had mattered to people responsible for their welfare. Joseph buried her in small cemetery where dozens of other Apache children rested, victims of diseases and malnutrition and neglect that killed reservation children at rates that would have been considered scandalous if victims had been white. Her death broke something fundamental in Joseph's spirit, destroyed whatever remaining hope he'd maintained that justice or compassion existed within a system that had killed his entire family across 18 months. Running Elk and Morning Star murdered by cavalry troopers who faced no consequences. Silver Dawn shot while trying to reach her daughter, her death officially recorded as combat casualty during legitimate military operation. Redbird dead from infection because Agent couldn't be bothered to provide medical care that might have saved her life. All 4 deaths completely preventable, completely unjust, completely ignored by authorities who viewed Apache deaths as regrettable but acceptable casualties of civilization's advance across continent. Joseph's behavior changed after Redbird's death. He stopped maintaining traditional practices openly, stopped teaching other children skills his father had taught him, stopped participating in reservation life beyond what was necessary to avoid punishment. He withdrew into himself, spent days sitting at Redbird's grave, became person that other Apache residents worried about because his grief was obviously consuming him, and because San Carlos offered no resources for helping people process trauma and loss. Agent Holt noticed change and interpreted it as positive development, as indication that Joseph was finally accepting defeat and beginning assimilation process that would transform him from Apache warrior into productive laborer who could contribute to reservation economy. Holt assigned Joseph to work details maintaining irrigation ditches and repairing roads, jobs that kept him occupied and that generated minimal wages that Joseph no longer bothered spending because he had no family to support and no interest in acquiring possessions when life itself seemed meaningless. The assignment that would change everything came in October 1883 when Holt contracted Joseph to railroad company building line through southern Arizona. The Tucson and Eastern Railroad needed workers for grading and track laying, hard physical labor that white Americans avoided when possible, that Chinese immigrants had performed until Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 had cut off that labor source, that railroad companies now filled with reservation Indians who could be hired cheaply and who had no legal recourse if working conditions were dangerous or if promised wages weren't paid. Joseph was transferred to Railroad Construction Camp in November 1883, along with 34 other San Carlos Apache men, all desperate for wages that exceeded reservation's minimal opportunities, none aware that railroad work would prove far more dangerous and exploitative than they had imagined. The camp was located 40 miles south of Tucson, high desert terrain where November temperatures dropped below freezing at night while climbing into 60s during day. Where workers lived in canvas tents identical to those at San Carlos, but with even less protection against weather because railroad company viewed housing as unnecessary expense when workers were temporary labor force that could be replaced if injuries or illness reduced productivity. The work was brutal, clearing brush and grading roadbed through rocky terrain, laying cross ties and rails that weighed hundreds of pounds, and that required teams of men working in dangerous coordination to position properly. Joseph's shoulder, healed but still weak from 1881 gunshot wound, ached constantly during 12-hour shifts that began at dawn and ended after dark. Railroad foreman named Dutch Williams drove workers relentlessly, punished any slowdown by reducing rations or extending shifts, treated Apache laborers as replaceable animals whose suffering was irrelevant as long as track construction remained on schedule and under budget. Joseph endured 3 months of railroad work, saved every dollar of wages he earned, calculated that continuing for another year would give him enough money to potentially leave reservation legally by purchasing land somewhere that Apache people might be tolerated if they had resources to sustain themselves independently. But the calculation assumed he'd survive a year of railroad work, assumption that became questionable in February 1884 when accident during track laying crushed 3 workers beneath rail that slipped from positioning chains. Williams blamed workers for accident, claimed they'd failed to follow procedures, refused to provide medical treatment beyond basic first aid that one worker who'd served as Army medic administered using supplies from personal kit. 2 of 3 injured men died within days from internal injuries that proper hospital care might have treated successfully. Third man lost leg to infection after crushed bones were set improperly, and wound care was inadequate to prevent bacteria from entering bloodstream. Joseph's rage returned watching men die from injuries that were railroad companies' responsibility, but that Williams characterized as workers' fault. He confronted Williams after third man died, demanded that company provide proper medical care and safer working conditions, pointed out that treating workers as disposable was morally wrong, regardless of whether it was legally permissible. Williams responded by having Joseph arrested for insubordination, told sheriff that dangerous Apache agitator was threatening violence and needed to be removed from camp before he incited other workers to rebellion against legitimate authority. Joseph was transferred to Yuma Territorial Prison in March 1884, sentenced to 5 years for threatening railroad foremen and inciting worker unrest, charges that were fabricated but the territorial judge accepted without question, because Williams's testimony as white railroad supervisor carried more weight than Joseph's denial or than testimony from Apache workers who'd witnessed confrontation and knew no threats had been made. The conviction represented judicial system's casual racism, its willingness to imprison indigenous person based on false testimony, because maintaining social hierarchy mattered more than ensuring accurate verdicts. Yuma Territorial Prison was nightmare facility, 3-year-old institution built to house 120 inmates in cells carved into rock hillside overlooking Colorado River, already overcrowded to 180 prisoners by 1884. Scheduled to expand but currently operating in conditions that made San Carlos Reservation look comfortable by comparison. Joseph arrived to find cells measuring 8 feet by 10 feet, housing 3 to 4 prisoners, temperatures inside reaching 110 degrees. During summer when rock walls absorbed heat and radiated it back continuously, creating an environment that killed weaker inmates and that drove others to madness that manifested in violence or catatonic withdrawal. The prison population was a mix of murderers, thieves, rapists, and men like Joseph, whose actual crimes were challenging white authority or refusing to accept subordinate status that racial hierarchy demanded. Mexican and Apache prisoners were treated worst by guards who viewed them as racially inferior and inherently criminal, who administered beatings for minor infractions, who reduced rations as punishment for perceived disrespect, who created atmosphere where survival required either becoming invisible or developing reputation for violence that made other inmates avoid rather than target you. Joseph chose invisibility initially, kept his head down, avoided conflicts, worked prison jobs without complaint, counted days until sentence would end, and he could return to San Carlos, where at least he'd been free to move around reservation, even if escape from reservation itself was impossible. But invisibility provided no protection in prison where guards targeted quiet inmates as easily as troublesome ones, where random violence was daily occurrence, where staying alive required constant vigilance and willingness to fight when fighting became necessary. If you're ready to hear how Joseph transformed from peaceful Apache farmer into the shadow walker who would kill 23 people across Appalachian mountains, hit that subscribe button. But understand this story contains account of systematic violence emerging from injustices that destroyed indigenous family and that created person whose capabilities and determination would make him unstoppable when he finally decided that survival required escape regardless of consequences, that remaining within system that had killed everyone he loved guaranteed his own eventual death, and that freedom was worth any risk or violence necessary to achieve it. Joseph's first year at Yuma Territorial Prison taught him lessons that would prove essential when he eventually reached Appalachian Mountains 200 miles away. The most important lesson was that survival required becoming someone completely different from peaceful farmer who'd lived quietly in White Mountains with his family. Prison didn't reward kindness or compliance beyond minimum necessary to avoid solitary confinement. It rewarded calculated violence, strategic alliances, and reputation for being more dangerous than people who might consider you potential victim. The transformation began in July 1884, when cellmate named Rodrigo Mendez, Mexican horse thief, serving 7 years for stealing cavalry mounts from Fort Huachuca, decided Joseph's silence and withdrawn demeanor indicated weakness that could be exploited. Mendez started small, taking Joseph's food rations during evening meal, pushing him aside when entering cell, making comments in Spanish that other Mexican inmates found amusing about Apache people being conquered dogs who accepted whatever treatment whites decided to give them. Joseph tolerated this for 2 weeks, calculating that responding would create problems exceeding minor humiliations. But Mendez interpreted tolerance as confirmation of weakness, escalated to physical intimidation, shoved Joseph hard enough to knock him against the cell wall, stood over him demanding Joseph acknowledge Mendez's dominance by calling him Jefe in front of other inmates who'd gathered to watch confrontation that seemed destined to end with Joseph beaten and permanently marked as easy target. What happened next surprised everyone, including Joseph himself. Decades of Apache training, suppressed during peaceful years with Silver Dawn and Red Bird, suppressed further during San Carlos confinement and railroad work, emerged completely when Mendez reached down to grab Joseph's shirt. Joseph's hands moved faster than Mendez could track, striking throat and solar plexus simultaneously, dropping larger man to ground, gasping for air while Joseph stood over him, explaining quietly in Spanish that next time Mendez touched him, it would be last thing Mendez ever did. The fight lasted perhaps 5 seconds, ended before guards noticed, concluded with Mendez unable to speak for 3 days due to throat damage, and other inmates understanding that quiet Apache man was far more dangerous than appearance suggested. Joseph's reputation shifted overnight from potential victim to person who should be left alone, whose silence reflected self-control rather than weakness, whose capabilities exceeded what most inmates could match if violence became necessary. Prison guards noticed change in Joseph's status, saw how other inmates gave him space, observed that conflicts near him de-escalated rather than escalated because nobody wanted to be next person whose throat Joseph crushed in 5-second confrontation. Head guard Samuel Morrison, no relation to murdered Arizona store owner, appreciated inmates who maintained order through reputation rather than creating constant disruptions requiring guard intervention. Morrison began giving Joseph better work assignments, placing him on details that offered more freedom of movement and occasional access to supplies that made prison life marginally more tolerable. The better assignments allowed Joseph to observe prison operations comprehensively, to understand guard routines and security procedures, to identify vulnerabilities that could potentially be exploited if escape became necessary. He wasn't actively planning escape in 1884, still believed he'd serve 5 years and return to San Carlos where life would be miserable, but at least not confined to 8 or 10 cell with 3 other men. But observing and learning cost nothing, and knowledge might prove valuable if circumstances changed in ways that made escape preferable to continued imprisonment. Joseph's education and prison survival accelerated through friendships with 2 inmates who recognized him as someone worth teaching rather than exploiting. The first was Patrick O'Brien, Irish immigrant serving 15 years for killing a ranch foreman who'd cheated him of wages, who'd learned railroad construction during 10 years working crews from Chicago to San Francisco, who taught Joseph more about eastern United States geography and industrial operations than Joseph had ever known existed. O'Brien described coal mining operations in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, explained how railroads connected eastern cities that contained more people than entire Arizona territory, painted picture of America completely different from southwestern deserts Joseph had known his entire life. The second teacher was William Standing Bear, Lakota Sioux from Dakota Territory, imprisoned for 8 years for killing deputy sheriff who'd raped his daughter. Standing Bear had traveled extensively before imprisonment, worked various jobs from Minnesota to California, possessed knowledge of different regions and populations that he shared with Joseph during evening conversations when cellmates discussed anything except prison conditions and sentences that stretched ahead interminably. Standing Bear described Appalachian mountains, explained they were different from Rockies or southwestern ranges that Joseph knew, covered in forests so thick that sunlight barely reached ground in summer, populated by white settlers whose poverty and isolation made them hostile to outsiders, but whose dispersed settlements and rugged terrain made region ideal for anyone seeking to disappear from authorities. Standing Bear's descriptions planted seed in Joseph's mind, suggestion that if escape from southwestern prisons and reservations ever became necessary, Appalachian region might offer refuge that deserts couldn't provide. The turning point came in April 1886, 2 years into Joseph's 5-year sentence, when Warden announced new policy requiring all Apache and Mexican prisoners to work in prison quarry rather than in maintenance jobs that offered variety and occasional respite from Arizona heat. The policy was explicitly racist, implemented after territorial legislature complained that prison was treating indigenous and Mexican inmates too leniently. That hard labor in quarry would be more appropriate for prisoners whose racial characteristics supposedly made them suited for physical work requiring minimal intelligence. Quarry work was punishment disguised as labor assignment. Temperatures in quarry reached 120 degrees during summer. Stone dust created respiratory problems that killed older inmates within months. Injuries from rock falls and equipment failures were common because safety procedures were minimal and because guards viewed injured prisoners as disciplinary problems rather than workers deserving protection. Joseph understood immediately that 2 years in quarry would likely kill him, that surviving until 1889 release date was improbable given conditions, and given that his shoulder injury made him vulnerable to accidents that healthy workers might avoid. He began planning escape seriously in May 1886, studying guard patterns obsessively, noting that security was concentrated near main gate and cell blocks, while perimeter walls received minimal attention, because Warden believed Arizona desert provided security that walls couldn't improve. Most escaped prisoners died of dehydration within days, their bodies found by patrols that tracked from prison to locations where water sources should have sustained fugitives but didn't, because men unfamiliar with desert survival couldn't find or recognize available resources. But Joseph was Apache, raised in desert, trained by running elk to locate water sources that others would miss, capable of surviving on minimal resources while covering distances that would kill men dependent on regular food and water. His escape plan relied on advantages other prisoners lacked, on knowledge that made desert ally rather than enemy, on capabilities that running elk had developed in him through childhood training that now offered pathway to freedom. The opportunity emerged June 12, 1886, when guard rotation changed during evening count, creating 15-minute window when section of perimeter wall was unwatched, because outgoing guard left post before replacement arrived. Joseph had been cultivating relationship with Mexican trustee who worked kitchen, had traded small favors and conversation for access to extra food that he'd been hoarding for 2 weeks, storing dried beans and tortillas that wouldn't spoil in desert heat, accumulating supplies for journey he'd planned meticulously. Joseph went over a wall at 7:45 p.m., dropping 12 feet to ground outside prison, running immediately toward Colorado River that flowed half-mile from prison walls. He reached river at dusk, swam across to California side, emerged dripping and ran northeast toward mountains visible in fading light, covering 8 miles before stopping to rest in rocky outcrop that concealed him from any pursuit that might follow when morning count revealed his absence. Prison authorities discovered escape during morning count June 13th, deployed tracking party by 7 a.m., confident that Apache escapee would be recaptured within 2 days, because desert provided no cover and no resources for sustained flight. But tracking party lost Joseph's trail 15 miles from prison, found where he'd crossed several times to confuse dogs, where he'd walked on rocks to avoid leaving footprints, where he'd used techniques that Apache people had refined across centuries of moving through hostile territory while avoiding enemies. Joseph traveled northeast for 3 weeks, following mountain ranges that offered water sources and game, avoiding settlements and roads where he might be spotted and reported, covering 400 miles to Utah territory before turning east toward Colorado. He'd decided during planning that reaching Appalachian Mountains required crossing Continental Divide, Traveling through regions where Apache escapee from Arizona prison would be unexpected, and where his appearance might not immediately trigger recognition from lawmen checking for fugitives. The journey tested every survival skill running elk had taught him. Joseph ate rabbits and lizards caught with snares made from plant fibers, found water in seeps and springs that others would miss, slept during day and traveled at night when possible to avoid being seen. His stolen prison clothes wore out within 2 weeks, replaced by garments taken from clotheslines and unattended campsites, assembled gradually into outfit that wouldn't identify him as escapee if seen from distance. By August 1886, Joseph had reached eastern Colorado, 800 miles from Yuma, far enough that pursuit had certainly ended, but not far enough to feel safe given that territorial authorities circulated descriptions of escaped prisoners throughout western regions, where lawmen might encounter fugitives months or years after escapes occurred. He needed to reach territory where Arizona prison escapee wouldn't be expected, where Apache man could potentially blend into populations diverse enough that everyone who looked different wasn't automatically suspect. Patrick O'Brien's descriptions of coal mining regions guided Joseph's continued journey. O'Brien had explained that mining companies hired any workers who could swing pick and shovel, that immigrant laborers from dozens of countries created populations where no single ethnic group dominated, that Appalachian coal towns offered employment without extensive background checks because mine operators cared more about productivity than workers' histories or legal status. Joseph traveled east through Kansas and Missouri during fall 1886, working occasional farm labor jobs to earn money for supplies, avoiding cities where police presence was concentrated, moving steadily toward coal regions that O'Brien had described. He reached southern Illinois in December 1886, found work briefly in coal mine near Harrisburg, discovered that mining labor was as brutal as O'Brien had warned, but that supervisors asked no questions about backgrounds if workers showed up sober and worked hard. The experience taught Joseph that he could survive in eastern regions, that his appearance didn't automatically trigger suspicion in areas where immigrant populations created ethnic diversity, unlike southwestern territories where Apache people were immediately recognizable. But Illinois mines also showed him that settling permanently anywhere meant accepting employment that would likely kill him within years. The coal dust and cave-ins and equipment failures destroyed miners as efficiently as quarry work, destroyed Yuma prisoners. Joseph continued east in March 1887, crossed into Indiana and then Kentucky, drawn by stories other miners told about eastern Kentucky mountains, where coal seams were rich and where mining camps were remote enough that authorities rarely visited, except when company operators requested intervention during labor disputes. The description resonated with Standing Bear's earlier accounts of Appalachian terrain, suggested region where man with Joseph's skills might disappear completely if he chose isolation over integration into mining camp populations. He reached eastern Kentucky in May 1887, emerged from flatlands into foothills that rose into mountains, covered with forests unlike anything he'd seen in Arizona. Oak and hickory and poplar trees grew so densely that walking off established trails meant pushing through undergrowth. But the forest also offered concealment that desert could never provide, created an environment where a person who understood how to move quietly and how to live on what land offered could avoid detection indefinitely. Joseph found work at Patterson Creek Mine in Pike County, Kentucky, operation employing 200 miners extracting coal from seams that ran through mountains surrounding camp that housed workers and their families. The camp consisted of company-owned houses, company store, where miners bought supplies on credit that kept them perpetually indebted, company doctor whose services were deducted from wages whether miners used them or not. The system was designed to trap workers in cycle of debt and dependence, to ensure that nobody accumulated enough savings to leave, even if conditions became intolerable. But Joseph had no intention of staying permanently. He viewed mining camp as temporary refuge where he could earn money, learn Appalachian terrain, and decide whether eastern mountains offered long-term sanctuary, or whether he needed to continue moving until he found a situation that felt sustainable. He worked underground for first time in June 1887, discovered that coal mining combined worst aspects of prison quarry and railroad construction, added constant danger of cave-ins and gas explosions that killed miners regularly without triggering improvements in safety procedures. Mine foreman Jacob Thacker ran Patterson Creek operation with casual brutality that reminded Joseph of Dutch Williams at railroad construction camp. Thacker pushed production quotas relentlessly, punished slowdowns by reducing payments for coal extracted, blamed miners for accidents that resulted from inadequate timbering and ventilation that Thacker refused to improve because safety investments reduced profits that determined his bonuses. Thacker particularly targeted immigrant workers whose limited English made them vulnerable to wage theft and whose lack of legal status meant they couldn't complain to authorities, even if authorities had cared about mining camp abuses. Joseph kept his head down initially, worked hard, earned reputation as reliable miner who could be assigned to most dangerous sections, because his composure under pressure meant he didn't panic when timbering creaked or when gas levels rose toward explosive concentrations. Thacker appreciated workers who didn't complain, gave Joseph better assignments that paid slightly more, treated him with marginal respect that other miners noticed and resented, because favoritism created divisions that prevented workers from organizing collective resistance to company exploitation. The resentment manifested in August 1887, when a group of Irish miners decided Joseph was receiving preferential treatment that should go to white workers. That Apache man working in Kentucky coal mine was taking job that rightfully belonged to European immigrant, willing to work hard for wages that would support family. The logic was twisted, ignored that mining company created scarcity by paying everyone minimal wages while generating enormous profits, blamed fellow workers rather than operators for conditions that kept everyone impoverished. Confrontation occurred underground on August 24th, when lead agitator Irishman named Sean Murphy accused Joseph of being company spy, reporting on workers who discussed organizing union to demand better wages and safety improvements. Murphy had no evidence, simply needed scapegoat for frustrations about working conditions. Chose Joseph because outsider status made him vulnerable to accusations that other miners might accept without requiring proof. Joseph denied accusation calmly, explained he had no relationship with management beyond doing assigned work, pointed out that Murphy's claim made no sense given that Joseph avoided conversations that might reveal his background or create connections that could expose him as fugitive from Arizona prison. But Murphy wasn't interested in logic, needed confrontation to establish dominance among Irish workers who looked to him for leadership, pressed forward aggressively until he was close enough that Joseph could smell whiskey on his breath, despite company rules prohibiting underground drinking. What Murphy didn't understand was that Joseph had already killed one man in prison yard fight during his second year at Yuma, had crushed Rodrigo Mendez's throat so completely during their second confrontation that Mendez had died 3 days later from injuries that prison doctor hadn't treated adequately. That killing had been Joseph's final lesson in prison survival, had taught him that sometimes violence needed to be definitive, rather than merely defensive. That half measures created ongoing problems while complete elimination of threats provided permanent solutions. Joseph struck Murphy once, fist driven into temple with force that running elk had taught him, generated maximum impact with minimum windup, technique that dropped Murphy instantly and left him unconscious on mine floor, while other Irish workers stood frozen, uncertain whether to attack or retreat. Joseph didn't wait for their decision, simply picked up his tools and walked to different section of mine, leaving Murphy's friends to carry him to surface and to decide whether incident warranted further confrontation. Murphy survived with concussion and permanent hearing damage in his right ear, injury that ended his mining career because balance problems made underground work too dangerous. He filed complaint with Pike County Sheriff James Crawford, claimed Joseph had attacked him without provocation, demanded Joseph be arrested for assault that had disabled him permanently. Crawford investigated half-heartedly, interviewed witnesses who gave conflicting accounts depending on whether they were Irish workers loyal to Murphy or miners from other ethnic groups who'd seen Murphy initiate confrontation. Crawford's report concluded that fight had been mutual combat rather than criminal assault, that both men bore responsibility for confrontation that had occurred underground, where supervision was minimal, and where resolving disputes through violence was common practice. The conclusion meant no charges would be filed, but it also marked Joseph as troublemaker in Crawford's mind, as someone to watch for future violations that might justify arrest and removal from county, where his presence was creating tension among mining camp workers. Joseph understood he'd become visible to authorities in ways that threatened his freedom. Crawford didn't know about Yuma escape, hadn't connected quiet Apache miner to fugitive from Arizona prison, but any serious investigation would reveal inconsistencies in Joseph's story, would trigger inquiries that might eventually expose his background and lead to extradition back to Arizona, where escape meant additional sentence, and where return to Yuma would likely result in death from quarry work or from guards who viewed escaped prisoners as deserving extra punishment. He quit Patterson Creek Mine in September 1887, told Thacker he was moving to different region for personal reasons, collected final wages, and left before company could create bureaucratic obstacles to departure. Joseph traveled northeast deeper into Kentucky mountains, following ridgelines and creek valleys into areas where human settlement was sparse and where isolation might offer security that mining camps couldn't provide. The journey took 2 weeks, covered 80 miles through terrain that reminded Joseph of Arizona mountains, except for vegetation so dense it transformed travel into constant struggle against undergrowth and fallen timber. He found abandoned homestead in October 1887, cabin built by settlers who'd left or died decades earlier. Structure still standing, but roof damaged and windows broken. Location was ideal for someone seeking isolation, situated in narrow valley with creek providing water, surrounded by ridges offering observation points and escape routes if authorities somehow tracked him to remote location. Joseph repaired cabin over next month, cut timber for roof repairs, chinked walls against winter cold that Appalachian mountains delivered with intensity that surprised someone accustomed to Arizona's mild winters. He hunted deer and turkey, trapped rabbits and squirrels, gathered nuts and edible plants, established sustainable existence that required no contact with settlements where questions about background might arise. The isolation was profound, reminded Joseph of years with family in White Mountains before cavalry had destroyed everything, offered opportunity to grieve losses he'd never properly processed while surviving San Carlos confinement and Yuma imprisonment and cross-country flight from Arizona to Kentucky. He spent evenings at cabin thinking about running elk and Morning Star, about Silver Dawn and Redbird, about how all 4 had died because American expansion demanded indigenous people be removed or destroyed to clear land for white settlement and resource extraction. Winter 1887-88 tested Joseph's survival skills against Appalachian conditions that differed fundamentally from Arizona environment. Snow fell heavily from December through February, accumulating to depths that made travel difficult and that required constant effort to maintain access to creek and to hunting areas. Temperatures dropped below zero repeatedly, cold that penetrated cabin despite fire Joseph maintained continuously, that killed unprepared wildlife and that made him appreciate how thoroughly running elk's training had prepared him for surviving harsh conditions. Joseph emerged from winter in March 1888 having proven he could live independently in Appalachian wilderness, that isolation was sustainable if he accepted loneliness's price for avoiding authorities and questions about background. But sustainability required occasional contact with settlements for supplies he couldn't produce, for salt and ammunition and metal tools that wilderness living demanded. These necessities meant risk, meant exposing himself to people who might remember Apache man living alone in mountains, who might discuss his presence with others until word reached authorities curious about hermit whose background couldn't be verified. The first supply trip in April 1888 took Joseph to Pikeville, county seat located 25 miles from his cabin, town of 800 people serving as commercial hub for surrounding mining camps and scattered farms. He entered general store operated by merchant named Thomas Morrison, no relation to murdered Arizona store owner or to Yuma prison guard, purchased minimal supplies using money saved from Patterson Creek mine wages, answered Morrison's friendly questions with vague responses about hunting and trapping in mountains. Morrison's curiosity was natural rather than suspicious, reflected small-town residents' interest in newcomers rather than official inquiry into backgrounds. But Joseph understood that repeated visits would generate more questions, that eventually someone would wonder why Apache man lived alone in mountains instead of working in mines where most outsiders found employment. The attention was manageable initially, but represented ongoing risk that could accumulate into problem, requiring either explanation or departure. The departure became necessary in October 1888 when Pike County Sheriff Crawford mentioned to Morrison that he'd heard about Indian living in mountains northwest of Pikeville. Asked whether Morrison had seen such person during store transactions. Morrison confirmed he'd sold supplies to Apache man several times, described Joseph's appearance and general direction he'd traveled when leaving town. Crawford filed information mentally, didn't pursue immediately, but made note that investigating Hermit's background might be worthwhile when time permitted more thorough inquiry into outsiders living in county without clear legal status or employment. Joseph learned about Crawford's interest through chance conversation with customer at Morrison's store, who mentioned in Joseph's hearing that Sheriff was asking questions about Indian living in mountains. The warning was unintentional, customers simply making conversation about local news, but it told Joseph that invisibility was ending. That continued presence in Pike County would eventually trigger investigation, exposing his fugitive status and resulting in arrest and extradition. He left cabin permanently in November 1888. Cash supplies he couldn't carry, set fire to structure to eliminate evidence of occupation that might help authorities establish timeline or patterns if they investigated location later. Joseph traveled east into Virginia, crossing state line into region where Kentucky sheriff would have no jurisdiction and where starting fresh might offer better prospects for avoiding detection than remaining in an area where he'd already attracted official attention. If you understand how Joseph transformed from Apache farmer to Yuma prisoner to Appalachian hermit, how each stage stripped away more of peaceful life until only survival skills remained, continue following this story as we reach Virginia mountains, where confrontation with Deputy Marshal will transform Joseph into Shadow Walker, whose violence will kill 23 people across 14 months before legend swallows truth completely. Joseph crossed into southwestern Virginia in late November 1888, entering Wise County through mountain passes already dusted with early winter snow. The temperature hovered around 35 degrees, gray clouds pressing down on ridgelines that stretched endlessly eastward, covered in forests that looked identical to Kentucky wilderness he'd left behind, but that represented fresh start in jurisdiction where his name meant nothing and where Apache Hermit hadn't yet attracted official curiosity. He carried everything he owned in canvas pack weighing maybe 40 pounds, supplies sufficient for establishing new camp and surviving until spring without human contact. Wise County occupied 404 square miles of Appalachian Mountains in Virginia's southwestern corner, populated by approximately 8,000 people in 18 Almaid. Most working coal mines or subsistence farms carved from hillsides too steep for efficient agriculture, but adequate for families willing to accept poverty in exchange for independence from mining company control. The county seat, Gladeville, held perhaps 300 residents around courthouse representing legal system that functioned sporadically when circuit judge visited quarterly to hear cases that had accumulated since previous session. Joseph found another abandoned homestead in December 1888. This one located in even more remote valley than Pike County Cabin, accessible only by game trail that crossed 3 ridges from nearest settlement. The cabin was worse condition than previous structure, walls partially collapsed and roof completely gone, but location offered advantages that outweighed necessary repairs. Creek flowing through valley provided reliable water. Surrounding forest held abundant deer and turkey populations. Most importantly, isolation was nearly absolute with no nearby farms or mining camps, where residents might notice smoke from Joseph's fire or encounter him during hunting expeditions. He rebuilt cabin through December and January, working despite temperatures that frequently dropped below freezing, cutting logs and splitting shingles and reconstructing structure that would protect against Appalachian winter's worst conditions. The physical labor was demanding but satisfying in ways that prison quarry work and coal mining had never been, represented building something for himself rather than generating profits for people who viewed workers as disposable resources. By February 1889, Joseph had created livable shelter, established sustainable routine of hunting and gathering that required no external contact, achieved isolation that felt like freedom, even though fugitive status meant true freedom remained impossible. The isolation lasted 3 months before March 1889 brought encounter that would transform Joseph's trajectory permanently. He was checking trapline 5 miles from cabin, walking ridge above valley where he'd set snares for rabbits, when he noticed 2 men on horseback moving through forest below, following creek upstream toward general area where his cabin was located. The men wore no uniforms but carried themselves with authority that suggested law enforcement, moved deliberately rather than casually like hunters or trappers would, examined ground periodically as though tracking rather than simply traveling. Joseph observed from concealed position for 20 minutes, watching men progress up valley, noting that lead rider seemed to be following trail despite absence of obvious tracks and leaf litter covering forest floor. The tracking ability was concerning, suggested someone with experience reading disturbed ground, someone whose capabilities might approach Joseph's own skills developed through Apache training and refined through years of avoiding detection while crossing continent from Arizona to Virginia. The men stopped near Joseph's cabin, dismounted and examined structure carefully, circled building looking for signs of recent occupation. Lead rider was older man, perhaps 50 years old, weathered face and careful movements suggesting decades of outdoor experience. Second rider was younger, maybe 25, followed older man's lead, but contributed observations that indicated he wasn't mere assistant, but tracker in his own right. Joseph watched from 200 yards distance, hidden in laurel thicket that concealed him completely, considered options that ranged from remaining hidden until men left to confronting them directly to ask why they were investigating his property. Remaining hidden was safest immediate choice, but didn't address problem that trackers capable of finding remote cabin would likely return with more men if they decided occupant needed to be questioned or arrested. Confrontation risked exposing fugitive status if men were law enforcement conducting systematic search for wanted criminals. The decision was made for him when younger Ryder pointed directly toward Joseph's position, apparently having spotted some indication of presence that Joseph hadn't realized was visible. Older man studied indicated area carefully, then called out in voice that carried clearly across distance separating them. "We know you're there. Come on down and let's talk peaceful. We're not looking to cause trouble if you haven't caused any." The statement was calculated reassurance that might or might not be truthful, depending on men's actual intentions. Joseph considered fleeing deeper into mountains, using terrain knowledge to lose pursuers who were on horseback and therefore limited to valley floors and established trails. But fleeing would confirm he had something to hide, would trigger pursuit that might eventually corner him in situation where violence became inevitable. He decided confrontation was preferable to flight, stepped from laurel thicket with hands visible and empty, walked down slope toward cabin where men waited beside their horses. Older man watched Joseph approach without drawing weapon, professional assessment suggesting extensive experience evaluating whether people represented threats. When Joseph reached cabin, man extended hand in greeting that seemed genuinely friendly rather than mere tactical courtesy. "I'm Deputy Marshal William Hackett. This is my nephew Thomas. We're working for Wise County Sheriff tracking some fellows who robbed mining company payroll last month. You seen any strangers passing through these mountains?" The question was straightforward, but the entire encounter felt like test, where wrong answer might trigger suspicion leading to questions about Joseph's background. He shook Hackett's hand, noted grip was firm but not aggressive, responded carefully. "Haven't seen anyone. Been living here alone since December, don't go into settlements much, mostly hunt and trap to survive." Hackett nodded as though answer was expected. "That's what we figured, cabin's pretty remote for casual visitors. Where you from originally? Not many Indians in these mountains. Stands out when someone new shows up." The question was casual but probing, attempt to establish background without formal interrogation that might make Joseph defensive. Joseph had prepared cover story during months of isolation, knew that complete honesty about Arizona origins would trigger questions he couldn't answer without exposing Yuma escape. He kept response vague but plausible. Came from Oklahoma Territory originally, worked various jobs moving east, ended up here because I wanted somewhere quiet. Haven't caused any problems. Pay for supplies when I go into town, just want to be left alone. The explanation was thin, but not obviously false, presented background that Hackett would have difficulty verifying, without extensive effort that remote hermit didn't warrant, unless specific complaints or evidence suggested criminal activity. Hackett seemed to accept it, asked few more questions about how long Joseph planned to stay, and whether he'd noticed anything unusual in surrounding mountains. Joseph answered honestly that he intended to stay indefinitely if permitted, and that he'd seen nothing unusual during months of living in area. Thomas, the younger nephew, seemed less satisfied with Joseph's answers, studied him with suspicion that suggested either better instincts or more cynical view of strangers living in isolation without clear legal status. But Thomas deferred to Hackett's judgment when older Marshall indicated conversation was concluded, mounted horse and prepared to continue tracking payroll robbers who'd fled into mountains after their crime. Hackett paused before leaving, turned back to Joseph with expression that suggested friendly warning rather than official threat. "You seem like decent fellow, just wanting to live quiet. That's fine by me and by sheriff as long as you're honest about not causing trouble. But understand that these mountains are smaller than they look. Word gets around about everyone living here. And if problems start happening near your camp, you'll be first person we come looking for. Stay peaceful and we'll have no issues." The message was clear. Joseph was now on official radar, even if not under immediate suspicion. Any future incidents in region would bring authorities directly to his location. The situation was manageable but uncomfortable, required that Joseph maintain perfect invisibility while knowing that Deputy Marshal Hackett and his nephew Thomas now knew where he lived and would remember Apache Hermit if questions arose about crimes or disturbances in Wise County. Joseph watched them ride away down valley, disappear around bend where creek cut through rock formation, stood outside cabin trying to calculate whether encounter had compromised his security sufficiently that relocation was necessary. The decision was complicated because moving meant abandoning improvements he'd made to cabin, meant finding new location and rebuilding shelter before spring. Weather deteriorated into summer heat, meant accepting that nowhere in Appalachian mountains offered perfect security, and that eventually some authority would always discover his presence and ask questions he couldn't fully answer. He decided to stay, reasoning that Hackett had seemed genuinely uninterested in pursuing Hermit who wasn't causing problems. That relocating would simply restart cycle of establishing presence in new jurisdiction, where different authorities would eventually ask similar questions. Better to remain where he'd built functional shelter, and where at least one law enforcement officer had indicated willingness to ignore him if he stayed peaceful. Spring 1889 brought warming temperatures and blooming laurel that transformed mountains into landscape of extraordinary beauty, reminded Joseph of Arizona high country, during brief seasons when desert bloomed and when running elk had taught him to appreciate how harsh land could generate moments of profound loveliness. He hunted and trapped through April and May, accumulated deer hides that he planned to tan and sell in Gladeville during summer when supplies needed replenishing, maintained isolation that felt increasingly sustainable despite March encounter with Deputy Marshal Hackett. The fragile stability shattered in June 1889 when Thomas Hackett appeared at Joseph's cabin alone, arriving mid-morning on horseback with urgency that suggested official business rather than friendly visit. Joseph was working outside cabin, scraping deer hide stretched across frame, looked up to see young Deputy Marshal approaching, with expression that mixed anger and suspicion in ways that promised confrontation, despite Hackett Sr.'s earlier promise to leave Joseph alone if he caused no problems. Thomas dismounted before reaching cabin, walked final 50 yards on foot with hand resting on pistol holstered at his hip, stopped 20 feet from Joseph in position that suggested tactical awareness of distances and draw times. His opening statement was accusation rather than question. Mining supply shed was broken into 3 nights ago in Gladeville. Blasting powder and tools stolen. Uncle William thinks it was those payroll robbers coming back for supplies, but I think it was you. Remote cabin like this? Man living alone, you'd need powder for clearing stumps or whatever work you're doing up here. The accusation was baseless. Joseph had stolen nothing and had no use for blasting powder when survival required only hunting and trapping equipment he already possessed. He responded calmly, aware that showing anger might confirm Thomas's suspicions. I haven't been to Gladeville in 2 months. Haven't stolen anything from anyone. Your uncle checked me out in March. I told him I'm just living quiet. That hasn't changed. Thomas wasn't persuaded, seemed determined to prove Joseph's guilt regardless of evidence or logic. Uncle William's too trusting, believes people when they tell him what he wants to hear. I'm not like that. I think you're running from something. Probably committed crimes before coming here, and now you're stealing from settlements because living off land isn't as easy as you thought it would be. The accusation was closer to truth than Thomas could know, though crimes Joseph was fleeing were escape from prison and self-defense killing rather than theft of mining supplies. But acknowledging any criminal background would validate Thomas's suspicions and trigger investigation that would expose Yuma escape and result in extradition back to Arizona. Joseph maintained his denial, repeated that he'd stolen nothing and that Thomas was wasting time investigating innocent man instead of finding actual thieves. Thomas's response was to draw his pistol, not pointing directly at Joseph, but holding it ready in position suggesting threat was imminent. I'm taking you to Gladeville for questioning. Sheriff can decide whether you're involved or not. Don't make this difficult, just come along peaceful and we'll sort everything out at courthouse. Joseph understood immediately that going to Gladeville meant formal arrest, meant being placed in jail cell where escape would be impossible, meant providing identifying information that would eventually connect to wanted notices circulated after Yuma escaped 3 years earlier. He couldn't allow arrest without guaranteeing his own capture and extradition, but preventing arrest meant confronting armed deputy marshal whose death would transform Joseph from fugitive into murderer, wanted in multiple jurisdictions. The calculation took perhaps 2 seconds. Joseph's mind, processing options with clarity developed through years of survival situations where wrong choices meant death or capture. He couldn't submit to arrest and couldn't allow Thomas to leave with knowledge that Joseph had refused legal summons. The only option that preserved freedom was eliminating Thomas completely, ensuring Deputy Marshal's knowledge died with him, accepting that killing lawmen meant becoming exactly what Thomas suspected he was. Dangerous criminal whose crimes justified whatever violence authorities eventually deployed to capture or kill him. Joseph moved while Thomas was still explaining why resistance was pointless, covered 20 feet faster than young deputy could track, struck Thomas's gun hand with a piece of firewood he'd grabbed from pile near cabin wall. The pistol discharged as it fell, bullet passing harmlessly into ground, Thomas crying out in pain from shattered wrist bones. Joseph's second strike caught Thomas's temple, firewood connecting with force calculated to stun rather than kill immediately, dropping Deputy Marshal unconscious to forest floor. Thomas regained consciousness 2 minutes later to find himself bound with rope Joseph used for securing deer carcasses, propped against cabin wall with Joseph standing over him, holding both firewood and Thomas's recovered pistol. The young deputy's expression showed fear mixed with rage, understanding that situation had deteriorated beyond anything he'd anticipated when riding to cabin expecting easy arrest of Hermit, who wouldn't resist legal authority. Joseph's voice was quiet when he spoke, filled with regret about necessity that he genuinely felt. I didn't steal those supplies. I'm not criminal you think I am, though I can't prove that without revealing things that would get me arrested for different reasons. I gave you a chance to leave me alone, told you truth about wanting to live peaceful. But you couldn't accept that. Had to push until this became only option left. Thomas struggled against ropes, shouted that killing Deputy Marshal would bring every lawman in Virginia hunting for Joseph. That escape was impossible when entire state would be searching for cop killer. His warnings were accurate but irrelevant. Joseph had already accepted consequences when he'd struck first blow, understood that preventing Thomas from reporting this confrontation required permanent solution regardless of future manhunt it would trigger. The execution was quick, Joseph using Thomas's own pistol to shoot him once through head. Death instantaneous and as merciful as murder could be, when victim understood what was coming and begged futilely for mercy that Joseph couldn't grant without guaranteeing his own capture. Joseph dragged body into woods 300 yards from cabin, buried it in shallow grave covered with rocks to prevent animals from disturbing remains. Led Thomas's horse 10 miles west before releasing it to wander back toward Gladeville riderless, creating mystery about what had happened to Deputy Marshal who'd ridden into mountains and never returned. The killing marked Joseph's transformation into Shadow Walker, name that Appalachian residents would assign to Apache man who'd killed Deputy Marshal and disappeared into mountains where search parties couldn't find him, despite deploying over 100 men across territory. But transformation was incomplete in June 1889, would require additional violence before Joseph became legend that transcended individual man who'd simply wanted to live alone in peace, that American society refused to permit anyone who'd been designated as outsider, requiring control or elimination. Deputy Marshal William Hackett discovered his nephew was missing when Thomas's horse returned to Gladeville on June 16th. Still saddled but riderless, deputy's rifle missing from scabbard but pistol also absent, suggesting Thomas had drawn weapon before whatever confrontation had occurred. Hackett organized search party immediately, rode to Joseph's cabin with 12 armed men expecting to find either Thomas injured or Joseph fled after killing Deputy Marshal, and recognizing that escape was only viable response to murdering law enforcement officer. They found cabin abandoned, Joseph's possessions gone, fire cold for several days suggesting occupant had left shortly after Thomas's disappearance. Hackett searched surrounding area, found disturbed ground where Joseph had buried Thomas, excavated grave and recovered nephew's body with single bullet wound through head and shattered wrist, indicating he'd been disarmed before execution. The evidence confirmed murder rather than self-defense, showed premeditation in binding Thomas before killing him, transformed Joseph from suspicious hermit into wanted murderer whose capture became Hackett's personal mission. The manhunt deployed over 100 men across Wise County and adjacent regions in late June 1889, largest search operation in southwestern Virginia history, motivated by combination of official duty and personal vendetta that made Hackett relentless in pursuing nephew's killer. Search parties combed mountains for weeks, found occasional campsites where Joseph had stopped briefly but never located main camp where fugitive was hiding. discovered that tracking Apache warrior through Appalachian wilderness exceeded capabilities of mountain men who'd lived their entire lives in region. Joseph watched search parties from concealed positions, observed how they moved in groups too large for stealth, how they talked loudly enough that he could hear conversations from hundreds of yards away, how they followed established trails rather than moving cross-country through difficult terrain where pursuit would be effective, but uncomfortable. Their incompetence wasn't surprising given that mountain warfare against opponent trained in Apache tactics was outside experience of farmers and miners whose tracking skills worked fine for hunting deer, but failed completely against human quarry who understood how to use terrain and who possessed patience to remain motionless for hours while searchers passed nearby without detecting his presence. But Manhunt's size and persistence meant Joseph couldn't remain in Wise County indefinitely, couldn't return to abandoned cabin or establish new permanent camp when hundreds of men were searching specifically for him. He needed to relocate to region where Thomas Hackett's murder was unknown, where Apache man living alone wouldn't immediately trigger association with wanted killer from Virginia. The decision meant moving again, accepting that stability was impossible when fugitive status attracted violence, regardless of his desire to avoid confrontation. Joseph traveled northeast in July 1889, crossing into West Virginia through mountain passes that offered concealment from search parties still combing southwestern Virginia. He entered McDowell County, coal mining region where immigrant populations and transient workers created anonymity that isolated Virginia valleys couldn't provide, where Apache man might blend into diverse workforce if he accepted returning to mining labor he'd fled when leaving Pike County year earlier. The irony wasn't lost on Joseph that survival required returning to exactly the situation he'd escaped, that avoiding capture for Thomas Hackett's murder meant accepting coal mine employment that would likely kill him within years if cave-ins or explosions or black lung didn't cut life even shorter. But imprisonment or execution in Virginia were guaranteed outcomes if Manhunt succeeded. While mining offered at least possibility of survival, if he could tolerate brutal labor and avoid conflicts that had made Pike County employment unsustainable. He found work at Elkhorn Mine in McDowell County in August 1889, operation employing over 300 workers extracting coal from seams running through mountains that rose 3,000 feet above narrow valleys where mining camps clustered along railroad tracks. The camp was larger and more organized than Patterson Creek had been. Company town with proper houses instead of tents. Company store better stocked. Company doctor more qualified. But fundamental exploitation was identical. Miners paid minimal wages in company scrip that could only be spent at company store charging inflated prices, trapped in debt that prevented leaving even when conditions became intolerable. Mine Superintendent Henry Patterson, no relation to murdered Arizona store owner or to Yuma guard or to Pike County mine operator, ran Elkhorn with efficiency that prioritized production over safety, but that maintained enough order to prevent labor unrest that might attract outside authorities or negative press coverage. Patterson recognized Joseph's mining experience immediately, assigned him to experienced crew working deepest sections where coal quality was highest, but where danger from cave-ins and gas accumulation was greatest. Joseph worked through August and September without incident, kept his head down and avoided conflicts that had plagued Pike County employment, understood that invisibility was essential when wanted for Deputy Marshal's murder in state less than 100 miles away. But invisibility was impossible in mining camp, where 300 workers lived in close quarters, and where every new arrival became subject of speculation and gossip that passed time between exhausting shifts underground. The gossip reached critical mass in October 1889 when miner from southwestern Virginia joined Elkhorn crew, recognized Joseph's appearance from wanted posters that William Hackett had distributed throughout region, describing Apache man wanted for murdering Deputy Marshal Thomas Hackett. The recognition wasn't certain. Poster drawings were imprecise and Joseph's appearance had changed from months living rough, but similarity was sufficient that Virginia miner mentioned to friends that new worker resembled wanted killer. Speculation that spread through camp until reaching Patterson's attention. If you're beginning to understand how Joseph's attempt at peaceful isolation collapsed into violence that would claim 23 lives across 14 months, how each killing created necessity for next as authorities closed in and escape routes narrowed, continue following as we reach final chapter where Shadowwalker's campaign transforms from self-defense into systematic elimination of everyone hunting him, where Appalachian mountains become killing ground that no number of deputies can secure when opponent possesses skills and determination that make him effectively invisible until moment he strikes. Mine Superintendent Henry Patterson confronted Joseph on October 14, 1889, pulling him aside after morning shift ended, leading him to office in building overlooking mine entrance where supervisors monitored production and where disciplinary matters were handled away from other workers. Patterson's expression was serious but not hostile, suggested he was gathering information rather than making accusations, though outcome would depend entirely on Joseph's responses to questions about background and resemblance to wanted poster. Patterson closed office door, gestured for Joseph to sit, opened a drawer and removed folded paper that Joseph recognized immediately as wanted notice. The poster showed crude sketch of Apache man with long dark hair and angular features, physical description listing height around 5'10", age approximately 35, wanted for murder of Deputy Marshal Thomas Hackett in Wise County, Virginia. Reward offered was $500, substantial sum that would tempt anyone in mining camp where annual wages rarely exceeded $300. Man from Virginia says you look like fellow on this poster. Patterson began, keeping tone neutral. Says wanted man killed Deputy Marshal back in June. Disappeared into mountains before they could catch him. Now I don't jump to conclusions based on resemblance. Plenty of Indian fellows could match this description. But I need to ask directly, are you the man they're looking for? Joseph's mind calculated rapidly, weighing options that ranged from denial to flight to violence that would eliminate Patterson before a superintendent could alert authorities. Denial was least risky immediately, but wouldn't prevent Patterson from investigating further or from notifying Virginia lawmen that possible suspect was working at Elkhorn Mine. Flight would confirm guilt but might allow escape before authorities arrived. Violence would provide permanent solution but would add another murder to charges against him and would trigger manhunt in West Virginia identical to Virginia pursuit he'd barely escaped. He chose denial initially, testing whether Patterson's suspicions were strong enough to warrant immediate action. I'm not that man. Never been to Virginia before coming to West Virginia. Never killed anyone. Just want to work and be left alone. Fellow who thinks he recognizes me is mistaken. Patterson studied Joseph's face carefully, searching for signs of deception that Joseph worked to suppress. That may be true, but understand my position. If you are wanted man and I employ you knowingly, that makes me accessory. If you're not wanted man, but I report you anyway, I destroy innocent person's livelihood based on mistaken identification. Either outcome is bad, so I need to be certain before deciding how to proceed. The response showed Patterson was more thoughtful than most mine superintendents, willing to consider possibility of mistaken identity rather than immediately turning suspected fugitive over to authorities. But thoughtfulness didn't eliminate danger, merely delayed decision until Patterson gathered more information or convinced himself that suspicions were justified. Joseph maintained denial, repeated that Virginia worker was mistaken, offered to answer any questions that would establish his innocence. Patterson asked about previous employment, about where Joseph had worked before Elkhorn, about why he'd chosen West Virginia coal mines when opportunities existed elsewhere. Joseph provided vague but plausible answers, referenced Oklahoma origins from cover story he'd developed, mentioned various mining and railroad jobs without specifics that could be verified. Patterson seemed partially convinced, or at least unwilling to take definitive action based on one worker's uncertain identification. He concluded meeting by saying he'd make inquiries with Virginia authorities, would ask whether wanted man had distinctive scars or other identifying features that could confirm or eliminate Joseph as suspect. The decision gave Joseph perhaps 2 weeks before Virginia lawmen responded to Patterson's inquiry, before William Hackett learned that possible nephew's killer was working in McDowell County Mine. Joseph understood immediately that 2 weeks wasn't sufficient time to establish himself elsewhere. That fleeing would confirm guilt but remaining guaranteed arrest when Hackett's response arrived, identifying him definitively. The impossible situation required impossible solution, required eliminating Patterson before superintendent could contact Virginia authorities, required accepting that second murder would transform him into exactly what society had always claimed Apache people were, violent savages whose presence justified whatever force was necessary to control or eliminate them. The decision was easier than killing Thomas Hackett had been, Joseph's conscience already compromised by Deputy Marshal's murder, moral prohibitions against violence weakened by understanding that survival required actions that peaceful farmer from White Mountains would never have contemplated. He'd crossed threshold when binding and executing Thomas. Subsequent killings were merely tactical necessities rather than fundamental moral transformations. Joseph killed Patterson on October 16th, caught superintendent alone in office during evening hours when most workers were in camp dining hall. He knocked on office door, entered when Patterson called permission, closed a door behind him, and covered distance to superintendent's desk before Patterson could react to threat. Joseph's hands found Patterson's throat, squeezed with strength, developed through years of physical labor and refined through Apache training that taught efficient application of lethal force. Patterson struggled briefly, managed to knock lamp from desk, creating crash that might attract attention, but mining camp's constant noise from machinery and workers obscured sounds of confrontation. He died within 2 minutes, suffocation ending resistance, body going limp in Joseph's grip. Joseph arranged corpse in chair-facing desk as though Patterson had suffered heart attack or other natural death, left office quickly and returned to worker housing where his presence during evening hours wouldn't be remarkable. Patterson's body was discovered next morning when assistant superintendent arrived to discuss production schedules. Found Patterson slumped at desk with no obvious signs of violence beyond bruising around throat that suggested strangulation rather than natural death. Company doctor confirmed murder after examination, reported findings to McDowell County Sheriff Thomas Blake, triggering investigation that immediately focused on new workers whose backgrounds couldn't be verified and whose presence at Elkhorn had coincided with superintendent's death. Joseph was working underground when sheriff arrived at mine. Didn't learn about investigation until crew supervisor brought word that Blake wanted to interview all workers who'd interacted with Patterson recently. The summons meant Joseph's time at Elkhorn was finished. That remaining would guarantee arrest for Patterson's murder even if Virginia wanted notice, hadn't yet connected him to Deputy Marshal's killing. He left mine immediately, walked away from crew claiming he needed to retrieve tools from different section, emerged at surface far from main entrance where sheriff's deputies were stationed to prevent anyone leaving before interviews were completed. Joseph fled into mountains surrounding Elkhorn mine carrying only knife and what supplies he'd kept in work clothes pockets, abandoned everything else in worker housing, accepted that life as fugitive now required complete mobility and that accumulating possessions created vulnerabilities when pursuit could force sudden departure from any location. The transformation to Shadow Walker was nearly complete, required only accepting that survival meant perpetual movement through wilderness. That human contact meant danger requiring elimination before it could threaten his freedom. The manhunt for Patterson's killer deployed 60 men across McDowell County in late October 1889, combined with Virginia's search for Thomas Hackett's murderer when William Hackett learned through law enforcement networks that Apache man-matching wanted poster description had been working at Elkhorn Mine before superintendent's murder. Hackett traveled to West Virginia immediately, met with Sheriff Blake to coordinate searches, brought personal investment in capturing nephew's killer that transformed routine law enforcement into vendetta, driving both men to dedicate extraordinary resources to pursuit. The combined manhunt covered hundreds of square miles of Appalachian wilderness through November and December 1889. Search parties combing mountains in weather that deteriorated into winter storms, dropping snow measured in feet rather than inches. Joseph stayed ahead of pursuit through combination of Apache training and Appalachian terrain knowledge, moved constantly through areas where search parties had already passed, avoided established trails where tracking was easiest, survived on minimal food and accepted cold that would have killed men less prepared for harsh conditions. But movement required occasional contact with isolated homesteads, where he could obtain supplies, encounters that became increasingly violent as Joseph recognized that witnesses who could report his location needed to be eliminated before information reached authorities. The first civilian victim was a farmer named Robert Crawford in Buchanan County, Virginia, killed on November 28th when he discovered Joseph stealing food from smokehouse, confronted thief with rifle and attempted to detain him until sheriff could be summoned. Joseph killed Crawford with his own rifle, single shot through chest, fled before Crawford's wife could emerge from house and identify killer. Crawford's murder triggered additional search efforts in Buchanan County, expanded manhunt into 3rd Virginia County, and brought total pursuit force to over 80 men searching for killer whose appearance was now confirmed through multiple witness descriptions. But increased pursuit size meant decreased effectiveness as coordination between county sheriffs broke down and as search parties duplicated efforts rather than systematically covering territory that might harbor fugitive. Joseph killed two more civilians in December 1889, both during supply raids on isolated homesteads, both witnesses who'd seen him and who needed elimination before they could report his location. The victims were James Wilson, 56-year-old farmer in Tazewell County, Virginia, shot December 12th while confronting Joseph stealing preserved meat from cellar, and Elizabeth Morrison, 42-year-old widow in Russell County, Virginia, killed December 19th when she discovered Joseph sleeping in her barn and threatened to summon law enforcement. Morrison's death was particularly troubling to authorities because killing women violated unwritten rules that even violent criminals supposedly observed, suggested Joseph had descended into complete savagery that recognized no moral boundaries. The killing generated outrage throughout southwestern Virginia, prompted calls for military intervention when civilian law enforcement proved incapable of capturing murderer who'd now killed 6 people across 3 counties. Virginia Governor Fitzhugh Lee authorized deployment of state militia in January 1890, assigned 40 soldiers under Captain Richard Anderson to support civilian manhunt, provided military resources including tracking dogs and telegraph communications that would allow faster coordination between search parties. Anderson deployed troops throughout suspected territory in late January, established outposts at key mountain passes and along routes that fugitive might use when moving between counties. The military presence changed manhunt dynamics, introduced systematic coverage that civilian posses couldn't achieve, created a network of observation points that should have detected anyone moving through region. But Anderson's soldiers were conventional troops trained for linear warfare, lacked specialized skills for tracking individual fugitive through wilderness, struggled with terrain and weather that Joseph navigated easily using skills developed across lifetime of mountain living and refined through 3 years of fugitive existence. Joseph adapted tactics in response to military deployment, avoided travel completely during daylight hours, moved only at night when soldier observation posts were least effective, accepted slower progress in exchange for reduced detection risk. The adaptation meant increased time between supply raids, meant greater hunger and cold exposure, but preserved freedom that military cordon threatened to eliminate if he continued previous movement patterns. The stalemate persisted through February and March 1890 as Joseph avoided detection, while soldiers maintained cordon without encountering quarry they'd been deployed to capture. Captain Anderson grew frustrated with civilian law enforcement's inability to provide intelligence about fugitives' location, criticized Sheriff Blake and Deputy Marshal Hackett for inadequate coordination and for pursuing personal vendettas rather than conducting professional investigation that might actually locate wanted killer. The criticism created tensions between military and civilian authorities, reduced cooperation that was essential for successful manhunt, ironically improved Joseph's security by degrading pursuit effectiveness. He exploited tensions by moving between military and civilian search areas, staying in regions where jurisdictional disputes meant neither group took responsibility for systematic coverage, surviving in gaps created by dysfunctional coordination. But survival required supplies, and supplies required encounters with civilians who couldn't be trusted to remain silent about seeing Apache man traveling through region where everyone knew about Shadow Walker manhunt. Joseph killed 3 more people in April 1890 during supply raids that went wrong, victims who'd surprised him or who'd threatened to summon authorities before he could escape unseen. The deaths brought total to 9, established pattern of violence that made clear Joseph would kill anyone who threatened his freedom, regardless of whether victims were law enforcement officers or innocent civilians who simply happened to encounter him. The April killings triggered renewed manhunt intensity, Governor Lee increasing militia deployment to 60 soldiers, and authorizing whatever force was necessary to capture or kill Shadow Walker, whose body count justified treating him as military target rather than criminal suspect deserving arrest and trial. Captain Anderson received authorization to shoot on sight, ordered troops to fire on any Apache man encountered in wilderness areas where legitimate travelers had no reason to be present. The shoot-on-sight order created a situation where Joseph's survival required eliminating any military patrol that detected him, where being seen meant immediate combat rather than evasion that previous manhunt had allowed. The escalation transformed wilderness into combat zone where both sides understood that encounters would end in deaths, where professional soldiers hunted opponent whose capabilities they'd consistently underestimated, and who possessed advantages that military training couldn't overcome when terrain favored defender over attackers. Joseph killed his first soldiers on May 8, 1890, when 4-man patrol encountered him at dawn near his temporary camp in Dickinson County, Virginia. The soldiers spotted Joseph's fire before he detected their approach, surrounded position, and called for surrender before opening fire. Joseph's response was immediate violence developed through years of surviving impossible situations, killed 2 soldiers with rifle shots before they could establish firing positions, wounded 3rd soldier severely enough to remove him from combat, pursued 4th soldier who fled and killed him with knife before he could reach military outpost and report encounter. The patrol's disappearance triggered massive search by military and civilian forces, deployment of over 100 men into area where soldiers had last reported their position. The search discovered 4 bodies arranged deliberately near Joseph's abandoned campsite, positioned to send message that Shadow Walker was capable of defeating military patrols and that increased pursuit would simply generate additional casualties without achieving capture. Captain Anderson recognized the message immediately, understood he was facing an opponent whose tactical sophistication exceeded anything he'd encountered during conventional military career. Anderson's report to Governor Lee acknowledged that capturing or killing Shadow Walker would require resources beyond what civilian manhunt or limited militia deployment could provide, recommended either abandoning pursuit until Joseph made mistake that exposed him or deploying regular army troops trained for irregular warfare against skilled opponents. Governor Lee rejected both recommendations, refused to admit defeat against single fugitive, and refused to request federal military intervention that would acknowledge Virginia couldn't maintain order within its own borders. Lee instead authorized increased reward to $2 dollars, offered bounty that would tempt civilian hunters whose financial desperation might motivate persistence that professional soldiers lacked when facing an opponent who'd proven capable of killing military patrols. The bounty attracted dozens of would-be hunters, mountain men who believed their lifetime wilderness experience would allow them to succeed where soldiers had failed. Most abandoned pursuit within weeks after recognizing that tracking Shadow Walker exceeded their capabilities. But some persisted, driven by financial desperation or by overconfidence in abilities that Apache warfare tactics rendered inadequate. Joseph killed 6 bounty hunters between June and August 1890. Encounters that began with hunters tracking him and ended with hunters dead from ambushes they never anticipated and never survived long enough to learn from. The killings demonstrated repeatedly that civilian hunters were even less capable than military patrols, that Shadow Walker's advantages in terrain knowledge and tactical skill created situations where numerical superiority meant nothing when opponents couldn't locate target before target located and eliminated them. The bounty hunter deaths generated paradoxical effect, reducing pursuit intensity as potential hunters recognized that $2, the $1,000 reward wasn't worth dying for. That Shadow Walker had demonstrated willingness and capability to kill anyone hunting him, regardless of whether they represented official law enforcement or freelance mercenaries seeking financial gain. By September 1890, active manhunt had reduced to perhaps 30 men, down from peak deployment of over 150 during spring, when military intervention had seemed likely to succeed. Deputy Marshal William Hackett remained committed to pursuit, despite reduced resources and despite acknowledging that capturing Nephew's killer had become unlikely after 15 months of failed searches. Hackett's commitment was personal rather than professional, driven by family honor and by rage that Nephew's murder remained unavenged, while killer continued killing additional victims. He organized final major search effort in October 1890, recruited 25 experienced trackers and hunters, deployed them across territory where Joseph had been most active, hoped that systematic coverage would finally locate Quarry, who'd evaded capture for over a year. The search proceeded through October without locating Joseph, covered hundreds of miles of wilderness without discovering current campsite or obtaining intelligence about recent movements. Hackett grew increasingly frustrated, recognized that manhunt was failing despite best efforts, and despite deploying men whose tracking abilities should have been sufficient to locate anyone living in regional mountains. The frustration led to fatal mistake on October 28, 1890, when Hackett split search party to cover more territory, took only 3 men with him while investigating reported sighting of Apache man near abandoned mine in Wise County. The decision reduced force below minimum necessary for safety when hunting opponent who demonstrated capability to defeat larger groups, created vulnerability that Joseph exploited when he detected Hackett's patrol approaching his actual location. Joseph had been observing Hackett's search party for 3 days, tracking them while they searched for him, waiting for opportunity when their deployment created tactical advantage for ambush. The four-man patrol represented such opportunity, manageable force that could be eliminated before reinforcements arrived. Target that included Deputy Marshal, whose death would send definitive message that Shadow Walker would never be captured, and that continuing pursuit would simply generate additional casualties. The ambush occurred at dusk on October 28th. Joseph firing from concealed position that overlooked trail Hackett's patrol was following, killing lead tracker with first shot and wounding second man before remaining two could locate shooter. Hackett and surviving deputy took cover behind fallen logs, returned fire blindly toward general area where shots had originated, couldn't see Joseph through undergrowth and failing light. The firefight lasted 20 minutes, Joseph moving between positions to prevent Hackett from fixing his location, picking off wounded deputy with shot that penetrated inadequate cover, then killing Hackett's remaining companion when man tried to flank Joseph's suspected position. Hackett found himself alone, pinned behind cover that wouldn't protect against concentrated fire, faced with certain death if he remained, and probable death if he attempted retreat. Joseph called out to Hackett, voice carrying clearly through darkness that had fallen during firefight. "Your nephew died quickly, didn't suffer beyond knowing what was coming. I can give you same mercy if you stop shooting and accept what's happening. Or you can keep fighting and die slowly from wounds that will take hours to kill you. Choose now." Hackett's response was continued gunfire toward Joseph's voice, bullets passing harmlessly through branches above position, where Joseph had deliberately revealed himself knowing Hackett would shoot and would waste ammunition. Joseph waited until firing stopped, called out again. "You're out of ammunition now, can hear your hammer clicking on empty chambers. I'm coming to finish this. Dying with empty gun is poor end for man who's hunted me for 16 months. Joseph advanced slowly, rifle ready, found Hackett still crouched behind log, clutching empty pistol and waiting for death that couldn't be avoided. Joseph's final shot was through Hackett's head, execution identical to what he'd given Thomas Hackett 15 months earlier, completing family destruction that William had initiated when sending nephew to investigate Hermit, who'd simply wanted to live alone in peace. The massacre of Hackett's patrol marked effective end of organized manhunt, demonstrated definitively that Shadow Walker couldn't be captured through conventional pursuit, and that attempting to hunt him guaranteed casualties that authorities were no longer willing to accept. Virginia Governor Lee suspended active search operations in November 1890, acknowledged that continuing manhunt wasted resources without realistic prospect of success, authorized defensive posture where lawmen would investigate sightings but wouldn't conduct systematic searches through wilderness where Joseph maintained advantages that made pursuit suicidal. The suspension left Joseph free to move throughout southwestern Virginia and adjacent West Virginia regions without immediate threat from organized pursuit. But freedom came at cost of 23 deaths, victims ranging from deputy marshals and soldiers to civilian farmers and bounty hunters. Casualties that transformed Joseph from peaceful Apache farmer into legendary killer whose violence had exceeded anything regional residents had experienced during lifetimes lived in mountains where violence was common, but rarely reached systematic levels that Shadow Walker had achieved. Joseph disappeared completely after Hackett Patrol Massacre, stopped raiding homesteads for supplies, eliminated all contact with civilians that might generate reports about his location or activities. The disappearance was so complete that rumors circulated through 1891 and 1892, suggesting he died of exposure or injury. That Shadow Walker legend had outlived actual man whose survival had seemed impossible without occasional civilian contact for supplies and equipment. But Joseph survived, lived in complete isolation using skills running elk had taught him, accepted loneliness and hardship as prices for freedom that remained possible only through avoiding all human contact, regardless of personal cost. He emerged occasionally to observe settlements from distance, watched Appalachian communities grow and change, witnessed arrival of more railroads and mining operations that transformed wilderness into industrial landscape, felt increasing alienation from society that had destroyed his family and forced him into fugitive existence, where only option was death or perpetual flight. The sightings continued sporadically through 1890s, reports of Apache man seen briefly in remote locations, observations that generated brief excitement before observer acknowledged they couldn't be certain what they'd seen, and that pursuing Shadow Walker had proven futile repeatedly. The reports maintained legend, kept Joseph's story alive in regional folklore even as actual man, aged and weakened and accepted that remaining life would be measured in survival rather than achievement. Joseph's final confirmed sighting occurred in August 1902, 13 years after Thomas Hackett's murder, when elderly Hunter encountered Apache man matching Shadow Walker descriptions at Remote Spring in Wise County. The hunter reported that man appeared to be in his late 50s, moved with difficulty suggesting injury or illness, spoke briefly in English asking whether manhunt was still active before disappearing into forest. When Hunter confirmed that authorities had stopped searching years earlier but would certainly resume if Joseph's location became known. The encounter suggested Joseph had survived into early 1900s, had outlasted most people involved in original manhunt, including Governor Lee, who'd died in 1905, and Captain Anderson, who'd resigned military commission in 1897 after acknowledging his failure to capture or kill Shadow Walker. But survival came at cost measured in isolation and lost years, in transformation from person who'd loved family and sought peaceful existence into legend defined entirely by violence that circumstances had forced him to commit. Joseph Broken Wing's ultimate fate remains unknown. His death unrecorded in any official documentation, his burial location unmarked and forgotten. Regional folklore maintains he died in Appalachian wilderness, sometime between 1902, final sighting, and 1910, when reports ceased completely. That his remains lie somewhere in mountains where he'd lived final decades of life alone and hunted by society that had killed his family and destroyed every possibility of peaceful existence. The Shadow Walker legend persists in southwestern Virginia and adjacent regions, told in variations that emphasize different aspects of Joseph's story depending on teller's perspective. Some versions celebrate him as symbol of resistance against authority, as Apache warrior who'd refused to accept confinement and who'd demonstrated that indigenous people could defeat American military despite overwhelming numerical disadvantage. Others condemn him as murderer who'd killed 23 people, including innocent civilians, whose violence exceeded any justification that wrongful imprisonment or family deaths could provide. The truth encompasses both perspectives, acknowledges that Joseph's violence was response to institutional failures that had destroyed Apache family and forced him into fugitive existence, while recognizing that killing 23 people created suffering extending far beyond original injustices that had motivated his transformation into Shadow Walker. The families of victims, Thomas Hackett's widow, Henry Patterson's children, Robert Crawford's siblings, William Hackett's grandchildren, mourned losses that Joseph's survival had required, experienced tragedies that couldn't be dismissed as acceptable casualties of resistance against oppression. The historical marker at Wise County Courthouse summarizes irreducible complexity. Joseph Broken Wing, Apache man known as Shadow Walker, killed 23 people across southwestern Virginia between 1889 and 1890 while evading capture following murder of Deputy Marshal Thomas Hackett. His violence emerged from injustices including cavalry massacre of family in Arizona Territory, wrongful imprisonment at Yuma Territorial Prison, and confrontations with law enforcement during fugitive existence in Appalachian wilderness. Manhunt deployed over 150 soldiers and civilians without achieving capture. Ended when authorities acknowledged pursuit was generating additional casualties without realistic prospect of success. Joseph's ultimate fate remains unknown, though reports suggest he survived into early 1900s living in complete isolation. This marker reminds us that violence emerges from complex circumstances where institutional failures and individual responses create tragedies affecting multiple families across generations, and that legends simplify stories whose truths contain moral complexity defying simple condemnation or celebration. If this complete story made you grapple with how peaceful Apache farmer became, Shadow Walker responsible for 23 deaths, how institutional violence against indigenous family created fugitive whose survival required systematic killing, how Manhunt's failure demonstrated limits of state authority when pursuing opponent whose skills exceeded conventional law enforcement capabilities, how Joseph's legend obscures actual man whose choices emerged from impossible situations where every option carried terrible costs, leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories examining how historical violence emerges from institutional failures and individual responses, how fugitive existence transforms people into versions of themselves they'd never chosen to become, how legends simplify truths that contain moral complexity defying easy interpretation. Comment about whether Joseph's violence was justified response to family's destruction, or whether killing 23 people exceeded any justification that original injustices could provide, whether Manhunt's suspension represented pragmatic acceptance of limitations or failure to achieve justice for victims, whether celebrating Shadow Walker legend honors resistance or dismisses suffering his violence inflicted on innocent families. Because these questions persist wherever institutional violence creates fugitives, wherever survival requires decisions that peaceful people would never contemplate, wherever legends replace truths too complex for simple moral categories. Until next time, remember that Joseph Broken Wing wanted only to live peacefully with family in Arizona mountains. That cavalry massacre and wrongful imprisonment destroyed that possibility completely. That 23 deaths resulted from transformation that circumstances forced rather than choices he'd freely made, and that ultimately his story demonstrates how violence perpetuates across generations affecting everyone. It touches regardless of whether original injustices justified initial responses that created cascading tragedies extending far beyond immediate participants.